Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We'll give folks just a few seconds to join before we get started. All right, see the numbers climbing up and up. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, Trauma-Informed Approaches to Supporting Victims of Financial Scams. Next slide, please. We are delighted to have you join us today. We wanted to start with a few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and any materials that are shared today will be sent in a follow-up email to all those that registered in the next few weeks. You should be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you. If you cannot hear or you have any technical issues, please send a message to Robin Evans. We do not provide certificates of attendance for our webinars. Live captions are available for today's session. To turn on live captions, select the Show Captions button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, please share them in the Q&A box, which can be accessed by clicking the Q&A button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. This helps us manage the questions and ensures that we don't lose any in the chat. If time allows, we will address questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So hello, everyone. My name is Kim Camacho. I am a program manager with the National Center for Victims of Crime. My background is in social work, and I have over 10 years of experience working in the victim services field. In my current role, I offer training and technical assistance to victim service and other allied professionals, and I oversee several key projects here at NCVC, including our partnership with FINRA. So we do a lot of education about financial fraud and scams, and I'm honored to be joined by my colleagues, Julie and Rob. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Kim, and I'm so excited to be with you all today. Julie Wells, I'm with Give an Hour. We're a national mental health organization, and one of the priority populations that we focus on are victims and loved ones who've experienced financial fraud. We also are partners with the FINRA Foundation, and I'm so glad to be here with my friend Rob, who will continue to help educate us all.
Great. All right. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Rob Mascio. I'm a director with FINRA within their investor education department, as well as the FINRA Foundation. My focus within the foundation is on financial fraud and what we can do to educate consumers about the frauds that are out there, what we can do to respond to those types of frauds, and how can we assist victims who have been victimized. So I do a lot of work in the financial scam and fraud space. I've been with the organization for nearly 20 years, a variety of different roles. But excited to talk to you all today. So those of you who have been kind of following the series of webinars that we've done through NCVC, this one is kind of building off some of the past webinars that we did this year, focusing on financial fraud and scams, but moving more into that trauma-informed approach and working with survivors and victims. So if you haven't seen any of the prior webinars, Kim, I believe those are available on your YouTube.
Yes, I'll pop a link in the chat to those.
Perfect. So we will try not to overlap too much with what we've covered in the past. So if you're looking for more of that, like that basic "this is fraud" type of presentation, you'll find that in some of our earlier ones. So we've touched on kind of the fraud landscape. We've talked on a little bit about different victim support mechanisms and working with victims. And now we're going to build on that, continue building on that conversation. So looking forward to that here today. But first, we just wanted to kind of put this out there. I know it's a lot of words on a screen, but it's helpful to get at least one source's definition of financial fraud. So this is coming from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and there's a lot of different variations of what exactly financial fraud is and what it entails. But this is what the Bureau of Justice Statistics comes out and says, that financial fraud occurs when an individual or entity unlawfully obtains money or assets from another party through deception, manipulation, or other criminal means. So wanted to put this out here just to get us in the right mindset as to what financial fraud is. And we'll often kind of flip back and forth between financial fraud, financial scams, which kind of still encompass the same meaning here. So one of the most important things to keep in mind as we start talking about financial fraud and financial scams is anybody can be a victim. And in some of the past sessions we've talked about, we've got younger individuals who are being victimized actually at a higher rate than older individuals. Older individuals are losing more money than younger individuals, largely because they have more money to lose. But scams and frauds, they are targeting everybody. So everybody on this call is a potential target when it comes to scams and frauds. And likely, I mean, I would say nearly all of us, if not all of us, have received some kind of an attempt to access our accounts or anything like that to try to perpetrate that kind of fraud. And it could come in as a misdirected text message, or direct message through a social media platform, or through an encrypted chat like WhatsApp or Telegram. And a lot of times we might not necessarily think that that's a attempt to defraud us, but a lot of these frauds are starting out that way. So it's important to remember that anybody can be a victim, even financial professionals. So financial professionals can be targeted. Financial professionals can be impersonated. Mental health professionals are also in that group. They can be targeted. They can be impersonated. So fraud really does not discriminate. Anybody can and will be a target. So I want to make sure that we understand that from the onset, because it helps us wrap our heads around the fact that individuals that are being victimized, it's not because they lack intelligence or they lack the ability to identify that something seems false or too good to be true or anything like that. That's not the case. And we'll go through and talk about how these manipulation tactics that fraudsters use is really the mechanism to convince everybody that there could be something to continue down that conversation with. So age, income, education level, those are not necessarily protective measures when it comes to frauds and scams. And we also know that shame and silence, it increases an individual's vulnerability. And we've seen this through research that the FINRA Foundation has conducted on the impact of isolation and things like that. We also know through different organizations like Give an Hour, who's out there talking to victims and survivors and gathering that in-person intelligence. So we know that shame and silence is a significant contributor to vulnerabilities. Now, this is a little bit of a life cycle of a scam, and this came from the first four on the right side came from a project that the FINRA Foundation worked on with AARP, where we were trying to identify what could cause an individual to be a chronic fraud victim. From that study, we realized a lot of these components applies to really any type of a fraud victim, not necessarily just a chronically victimized individual. And then from there, based off of being informed from a variety of different sources, there's a few more areas that we've added, and I'll touch on those in a minute. So the life cycle of a scam, in order for a scam to occur, you have to have a lot of these different components. So first is the situation. The situation is that initial vulnerability for that person. It makes them susceptible to that initial pitch, or it's the environment that they're in that creates that vulnerability. So that could look like in a romance scam situation or a relationship scam situation. It could be the loss of a spouse, right? So the situation there is the loss of the spouse. And then move on to the trigger. The trigger is that moment that kind of initiates the whole thing. That's that outreach. That's that direct message through a dating website or a social media platform or a text message, a phone call, whatever it may be. That's that mechanism, that's that catalyst that starts the whole process. So that's the trigger. That's that moment of engagement. Then we move on to the motivation. And the motivation is important because that takes kind of that situation and adds what that individual is really trying to fulfill, what that motivational need is that they are trying to fulfill. So that's the area where fraudsters, they really try to grab onto that victim, and they use a variety of manipulation techniques to make sure that they are trying as hard as they can to fulfill that motivational need. So again, going back to that romance scam, that would be possibly the individual's need to feel wanted or to feel loved or to feel important, right? That's that underlying motivational need that enables that fraudster to come in and start emotionally manipulating them. Then the next component, that's the ability. And that solely comes down to the ability for that scammer to withdraw funds, to access funds. So some of the mechanisms that we try to talk about to put in place here, there are different types of structural interventions, but really it's going to be that access to fund that helps round out that scam cycle, that finalizes the monetary transaction when it comes to frauds and scams. Now, the next three kind of moves into more of that emotional impact. And again, these are the parts that were more informed by input that Given Hour has received through some of their peer support networks and talking with different individuals in the mental health space. So you have that, then you have the consequences, right? At some point, the individual who has been targeted realizes that, okay, this might be a scam. I might be a victim. And it might take a while to get to that point. They might not recognize it right away. It might take other individuals talking to that person to try to convince them that, look, this relationship is not real. But that's that moment of realization. And from there, then you move into kind of that aftermath. And that's where you start to see a lot of the psychological and practical fallouts, that long-term trauma that emerges afterwards. And in the case of a romance scam, again, you have not only the loss of funds, but you have that loss of a relationship, the loss of that connection that you've built with this person. Even though that relationship was built on a lie, it's still a relationship. And to that person that's been targeted and manipulated, it feels and is a real relationship to them. So they're mourning that loss of the relationship. And then oftentimes we do see this pattern of re-victimization, whether it's because they are looking to recover funds that they've lost, or maybe even recover that same emotional feeling so they go back out into the dating world, whatever it may be. But we do see oftentimes those that have been victimized, they are more susceptible to re-victimization. So I mentioned that we talked about in prior webinars about the different types of fraud. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I did want to put them out here just so you have them as a base here. There's a lot of different kinds of financial crimes and financial frauds and scams. A lot of them, nearly all of them, they are a form of impersonation. The person that is perpetrating the scam is impersonating in some capacity, whether it is an authority figure, whether it's a romantic interest, whether it's a financial professional, a law enforcement individual, whatever it may be, it's a form of impersonation. So we've got those kind of traditional investment frauds, and we've seen an increase in investment related fraud year over year. And this is based off of Federal Trade Commission data. We've seen nearly $1 billion rise in investment-related frauds year over year. So, and these include crypto. So we've seen a rise partly because it includes that crypto-related scams, but it also includes Ponzi schemes, pump and dump schemes, those type of more traditional investment-related frauds. Then we've got romance scams, which we're seeing romance scams sometimes having that cryptocurrency component. Relationship investment scams, which would be kind of that bridge between the romance scam and that investment related scam. Again, those often there's a terrible name. A lot of individuals can reference it as pig butchering. We like to use the term relationship investment scam or confidence investment scam because the wording behind pig butchering is just a terrible term. Though it is a term that people should be in the support realm should be aware of, because it is a term that is often talked about, whether at law enforcement level or at different organizations. Not a term we'd want to use with a victim or a survivor. Then I mentioned imposter scams, and all these kind of fit into those impersonations. And we still do have those mass marketing type frauds where it's large solicitations through phone, email, socials, a variety of different sources and mechanisms. So again, anybody that wants to learn a little bit more about different types of frauds, our first session that we did earlier this year would give you that kind of background. So after an individual has been, or during that whole victimization process, we talked about that motivational need at just a few slides ago, and criminals often look to manipulate that vulnerability. And that vulnerability could come in as maybe there's a boredom, there's a loneliness, that increases the individual's potential risks when it comes to susceptibility. There's a lot of different vulnerabilities. Age can be a vulnerability. So as we're talking about older individuals, you could have cognitive decline. You could have different mechanisms that make them potentially more vulnerable. Younger individuals, they are often the ones that are in that initial job market. So they're looking for their first job or their second job. They are often targeted for job-related types of scams. But all these things, we have to remember that it's an emotional manipulation. So not necessarily, it's not a gullibility thing. And we need to make sure that when we're thinking about victimization, we need to make sure that we understand this is a emotional manipulation. It's not a gullibility concept. It's not somebody who's greedy and things like that. It is an emotional manipulation. And we need to make sure that when we're interacting with victims and survivors, we keep that to the forefront of our minds. So I mentioned those manipulation tactics, and these are some of the ones that are often used. There's a whole series of different persuasion tactics. Again, I talked about that in an earlier webinar. So if you want to see that, you can take a look at those. But they're all a way to try to manipulate our thinking based on our emotions. So when an individual's emotions are hijacked, they often react in a way that they wouldn't under a normal state. So heightened emotion is a tactic that fraudsters use. They try to get us in this fight or flight type of mentality. They might use things like, oh, you have to act now, you have to do this immediately, and it gets us thinking that we have to move quickly. That manipulates our emotions. Social engineering is also coming into play. We've got, now with the rise of artificial intelligence, we're seeing the ability for scammers and fraudsters to essentially create personas and build pitch scripts that relate to an individual based off of what they're seeing on social media and things like that. We're seeing authority impersonations. That's kind of an old tactic that's been around for a long time, whether it's impersonating a law enforcement individual, a financial professional, a celebrity, whatever it may be, but those impersonations are quite large. Scarcity is a tactic, again, where there's time scarcity, you have to act quickly, or quantity scarcity, there's a certain amount of time or a certain number of these products or opportunities, and if you don't jump on it now, you're not going to have that opportunity. FOMO, that fear of missing out, is a large component that drives people to feel like they have to engage or they have to maybe invest in something that they normally wouldn't. Then we've got the technical jargon that often can confuse people and make people say there's this concept that there's certain types of individuals. Some individuals are comfortable asking questions, others are not. And through research that we've done, we've found that those that are more comfortable asking questions, they are more protected when it comes to engagement and victimization rates. And part of that comes in with that technical jargon. So if you have an individual that is afraid to ask questions because they don't want to, they're afraid they're not going to appear smart because of the technical jargon that's being used, that can open them up to potentially more engagement and victimization. And then phishing and spoofing, we get those all the time. I have gotten 3 this morning, right, since before our webinar started. And I'm sure you all are seeing that as well, whether it's phishing, spoofing through emails, or smishing through text messages, whatever it may be, they're coming at us from all different angles. And again, those are often impersonation plays. So moving more into kind of that emotional manipulation and this concept of trauma bonding, fraudsters use this to to really improve that manipulation that they have, that hold that they have over their target, over the individual. We see this a lot of times in relationship type of scams. And again, relationship scams doesn't necessarily mean romantic. Could be romantic. It doesn't have to be. But the individual, the perpetrator, is using these kind of this flattery, this love bombing, this control through manipulating an individual's emotions. So they often try to reinforce specific behavior, and there's also a punishment component. So if you can see on these slides here, these are messages that had gone back and forth between a victim and a perpetrator. And you can see on the first one on the left here, where they're building up that connection, building up that relationship. The perpetrator is flattering and supportive, but then you move forward as this relationship continues to develop. You can see kind of a change in their responses. There's a point in time where the target isn't responding. So that perpetrator then flips to, are you mad at me? How come you didn't say goodnight to me? What, you don't like me? You don't want to spend time with me anymore? What's going on, right? And that kind of that withdrawal of affection impacts those individuals that are being targeted. And either this happens at the end of a scam when the individual has maybe realized that this is not a true relationship, or it can be during that whole grooming process to get that person thinking, oh, well, I don't want this person mad at me. Let me continue that conversation. All right. So as we kind of move through this whole scam victimization journey, and we're in a role trying to support, and we're going to get into that supporting part in just a few minutes here. But it's important to think about the individuals that we're interacting with and the individuals that we're trying to support. They have lost that intimate connection. So especially if we're talking about somebody in a relationship type of scam, we should be thinking about ways that we can help them by replacing that relationship. And we're going to get into this a little bit more, but it's important to remember that once that connection ends with that scammer, there is that void. And in order to try to reduce that re-victimization rates, we should be looking for ways for that individual to find a healthy replacement for that relationship. All right, with that, Kim, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of go through a little bit more of this this journey map and dig a little bit more into that trauma component in supporting victims and survivors.
Thanks, Rob. It's super helpful to kind of get grounded in what financial fraud looks like, how it manifests, but we also have to talk about how it impacts victims. And so our friends over at FINRA and Given Hour created this really lovely graphic called the Journey Map, which really helps to illustrate the experiences of real victims. So things that we've heard from victims as they navigate their recovery journey and what their interactions look like at various stages. This graphic is just super helpful. We're not going to dive into it in depth here, but I am going to add a link to it in the chat, and there's also the QR code there on the screen. But I want to, if you could go to the next slide, I want to start to kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the kind of milestones that we see when we're working with victims as they're navigating their fraud recovery journey. I like to think of these as more of guideposts rather than stages. If you're familiar with like the stages of grief, for example, we don't just move kind of linearly through the stages as you see them on the screen. We might not necessarily move through these in the order. We might be revisiting grief while we're also rebuilding trust. And I see that we have a lot of kind of victim advocates on the webinar today. We have some folks from kind of various social service agencies and roles, and some prosecutors in the audience as well. And for really all of us, when we're working and interacting with victims of financial fraud, our job is not necessarily to kind of rush them and get them to this milestone of empowerment. We really have to meet them where they are, whether they're in crisis, they're searching for meaning, or they're learning to trust themselves again. Oftentimes, what we see kind of immediately following the fraud or at the point in time where a victim acknowledges and recognizes that they've experienced fraud, a lot of victims might experience a state of shock, panic, or confusion. And so before we can move into kind of any of these other milestones, right, before they can start processing what's happened, before they can do anything related to recovery, we have to first address any kind of immediate safety needs and offer that crisis support. And much like other types of crimes, financial fraud can be really traumatic. It's important that we create spaces for victims to be able to process their feelings that are coming up as the result of the victimization, and recognize that they might not necessarily just be grieving the financial loss, but they might be also grieving other losses, as Rob started to talk about, right? For example, in cases of relationship scams, they may be grieving the loss of that relationship. And so folks might experience feelings of shame and anger, loneliness and isolation. And victims oftentimes have to rebuild trust within themselves and with others. Um, they may be wondering, like, how could this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this? Or, we'll talk about some of this a little bit more in depth in the next slides, but, um, you know, that's important to recognize that they're going to be grappling with um, maybe some trust challenges. They might be hesitant to trust other professionals and institutions as the result of their experiences. Rob mentioned that they're also at higher risk for re-victimization. And so one of the things that many of us can do when we're engaging with victims is helping them kind of rebuild their confidence through educating them about red flags and things to look for. Research has really shown us that the people are less likely to engage in scams if they are aware of the scams that are out there and how they function. And so that's one kind of strategy as victim service professionals or other allied professionals that we can implement in order to support victims in reducing their risk for re-victimization and also helping build their confidence. And we can also help them by allowing them to practice setting boundaries, and finding and reestablishing some trusting relationships. Next slide, please. So, unfortunately, the emotional impacts are often overshadowed by the tangible financial losses of fraud. But nearly 2 in 3 victims experience at least one serious non-financial cost of fraud. And these can include things like severe stress, anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping, or isolation. And while financial recovery might be kind of top of mind for a lot of victims, it's also important that we acknowledge the emotional toll that this might have and offer space for victims to process those feelings and address maybe other needs that have come up. Next slide, please. So in nearly every case, we end up talking about much more than money with victims. Some victims have kind of their whole world has been turned upside down. They may have lost their retirement, their home, their kids' college fund. And that type of financial strain alone can trigger anxiety, depression, or even suicidal ideation, especially if they now have to make really big adjustments in their life, like returning to work or really dramatically changing kind of what they envisioned for their life or what plans they had. And then there's deeper themes that are very psychological. We often hear from victims, some things they say might be, how could I have been so stupid? I feel like I betrayed my family. I don't know if I can ever trust myself again. And so it's not uncommon that victims will internalize what's happened to them as a personal failure. And so the work isn't just about stabilizing them, it's also about untangling their identity from the fraud, and helping them, understand that this was not their fault. And it was really, we have to really shift the focus to what did the perpetrator do in order to manipulate you, deceive you, and exploit you, right? And it's not a victim's fault. And like Rob mentioned, anyone can be a target. And so thinking back to someone saying, how could I have been so stupid, right? Helping educate folks that anyone, everyone is targeted by financial fraud. It's not just one particular education level or socioeconomic background. People across the board are victims of financial fraud. Next slide. So one thing I think is really helpful to talk about here is understanding kind of the impact on a person's kind of worldview and their identity. FINRA has done some research that shows that a person's worldview can kind of contribute to or shape their risk to scams. So those that hold kind of this rigid all or nothing belief system, for example, believing that the world is either good or bad, fair or unfair, can be at higher risk for victimization. Victims who believed that people are basically good and the world is fair, they might ignore red flags because they can't, imagine that someone would intentionally deceive another person. Others that believed life is unfair and nothing good comes my way might also just be open to more kind of financial opportunities that present themselves to them, thinking, I have to take what I can. This has been presented to me, and I gotta take that opportunity. I do want to note that not all victims that hold kind of that worldview are, they won't necessarily have that worldview. Particularly folks from marginalized groups, they may already recognize that there, systemic unfairness. And for them, fraud can compound that existing experience of injustice that they might be experiencing as they move through the world. After fraud, these worldviews can fracture, which can also impact how a victim views themselves. And so we hear victims will say, I can't believe people are capable of this, or everything I thought I knew about the world was wrong. And that can be pretty devastating, right? Like our whole perspective has changed. And so there can be some grief and loss that comes along with that as well. But alternatively, FINRA, through their research, also found that people that hold a more flexible worldview, so believing that the world can be both fair and unfair, that people can be both trustworthy and untrustworthy, are typically less vulnerable. Flexible thinking, right, creates a lot of space for caution, skepticism, and hesitation when something is feeling off. Victims may be grieving not just money or trust in themselves, but also the collapse of this worldview. So helping them rebuild identity involves creating a space to process kind of that moral injury and to reframe their worldview in a more kind of balanced and resilient way. We also have to recognize that the impact of this might erode their trust in institutions. So victims oftentimes will experience challenges when reporting the fraud, and so they may not be believed or taken seriously. When they're reporting, the institution or the system that they're reporting to may not be equipped to respond to them. Or they might even experience some barriers and challenges through the recovery process. And so this can reinforce, a sense of abandonment or injustice, right? They've already experienced something that was really unfair. They were targeted and victimized. In the cases of relationship scams, right, they might be feeling that sense of abandonment, and so that can be compounded when they're also experiencing that at a systemic level. They can experience kind of that double injury or re-traumatization first from the fraud and then from the systemic responses. Next slide, please. So with all of that, recovery from fraud can be a really complex journey for a lot of people. Unfortunately, full recovery of your financial losses from fraud is pretty rare, and that's due to a number of different reasons. So it's really important that as those of us that might be interacting with a victim following an experience of fraud, that we really frame that recovery from a holistic approach. And so these are some really important things to be aware of that folks might experience as a part of their recovery journey. It's not uncommon for many victims to experience denial or to rationalize the actions of the perpetrator. Again, especially true in cases of relationship scams or where they maybe knew the perpetrator. Maybe it was a trusted financial advisor or someone within their community that they knew. And denial and rationalization are really powerful kind of ways that as humans we're protecting kind of our self-image. And it might also be a way to kind of hold on to either that relationship or kind of that reality, and not have to kind of acknowledge that my reality has now shifted in a really significant way. One thing that we hear, I would say almost every time we do a training, and I know for folks that are working directly with victims or loved ones, we hear a lot from loved ones about how difficult it can be trying to convince the victim or show them that what they're experiencing is fraud. And so it's really important that we meet people where they are. They may not be ready to acknowledge what is happening. And I know that can be really hard as a loved one to see a person maybe continuing to engage with a scammer, knowing that that's what's happening. But all we can do is meet them where they're at and be ready and available to support them when they're ready. And I know Julie is going to talk a little bit later in our time together about how we can support kind of loved ones and what that looks like. So trauma-informed approaches are a really critical aspect of fraud recovery. And we're going to shift into kind of taking a deeper dive into some language that we can use so that we can help to, prevent a victim feeling kind of that shame or using language that might prevent them from reporting or seeking additional support. So we can move to the next slide. Language is such a powerful tool, and it really can greatly impact a victim's healing journey. So remembering that our words matter, they can either support recovery or they can also inadvertently cause harm. And unfortunately, when we're talking about financial fraud and scams, just in general, right? If you think about news stories that you've seen about scams, a lot of the language that we use has such an undertone of victim blaming. We say things like, this person fell for a scam, right? Placing kind of the blame on that person for engaging with the scam. And so we want to be really mindful about how we talk about this, particularly when we're talking about it with victims, but also just generally when we're talking with other folks in the systems that we work in. We want to be really mindful about the language that we use. And so these are some really simple kind of phrases that all of us can use when we're engaging with victims. So first consider the phrase there at the top, you were targeted, right? That's a really powerful acknowledgement that ultimately places the responsibility where it belongs, on the perpetrators. The next one, this is not your fault. For those of you that interact with victims of other crimes, this is probably something that is already kind of in your tool belt and something that you're already using. And it can also apply to working with victims of financial fraud. This is really crucial for reducing, internalized blame. And it's a reminder that the fault lies not with the victim, but with those that betrayed their trust. Which leads us into that last one. This was a betrayal of trust. So that reinforces the victimization. It helps to foster self-compassion and healing, right? Recognizing that this was not something that the victim did, but it was someone that, you know, intentionally manipulated, targeted them. And it also acknowledges that loss of trust, right? And so I think that's really important. There's also some really great resources out there with some additional guidance on using supportive language. I'm going to pop a link in the chat here to the AARP handout that you see on the screen. So I encourage folks to check that out and just be really thoughtful and intentional about how you're talking about financial fraud, both with victims and just in general. We can move to the next slide. So I think this is, again, just another important reminder for us that victims might not be ready to find lessons or silver linings to this experience, particularly in the beginning, but they might not just ever be ready to hear that. And so a lot of times, really what victims need is a space to be heard, to tell their story in their own time, to have their experience validated, and to know that it matters. And so just being a person that will listen and validate can be a really powerful tool in their healing process. Next slide. There's also some barriers that come with disclosing fraud, and shame and fear can be some of the most prevalent ones. Many victims may never ever even report the fraud, or they might delay reporting for fear of how other people are going to respond. So they might fear that they're not going to be believed or taken seriously. They might just be too ashamed or embarrassed, right, to tell someone that this has happened to them. They might have had negative experiences in the past that also prevent them from being ready to disclose. They might also just not be ready to admit that what they've experienced was a scam. If someone does receive a negative response when they disclose to someone, which oftentimes they might start with a family member or a friend, but this also can happen with professionals that they might be engaging with, this can really impact their willingness to disclose to others, to seek out reporting options or other help. And that's why it's so important for us to respond in a trauma-informed way. Disclosure is a process, and there are a lot of different pathways a victim can choose. We can help them understand what reporting options they have. So depending on the type of fraud that they've experienced, right, they might have a number of different options from government oversight agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, law enforcement, victim hotlines, banking institutions, tech platforms. And so we can kind of guide them through what those options are and what the process will look like. And even if victims choose not to report, they might benefit from accessing services from mental health professionals, victim services, or peer support groups. Next slide, please. So I will just leave you with this before I turn it over to Julie. And again, this should be this is like our bread and butter as victim service professionals, right? There is a lot of healing power in believing victims. And so imagine a victim says this to you. You're the first person who's ever said that to me. Not my family, not the bank, not law enforcement. No one said that they were sorry, right? So that really small act of just acknowledging their pain can be one of the most healing things that we do. Julie's going to take a deeper dive into some additional strategies, as well as how do we take care of ourselves as helpers? Because this can also be really difficult for us to navigate as well. So I'm going to, with that, turn it over to Julie.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've done in this space. And at Given Hour, we are not on the prevention end of the first time someone is victimized by financial fraud. Oftentimes, we encounter individuals who are either still actively engaged in the fraud or just realizing they've been engaged in a fraud. And so we focus a lot on the healing process and on preventing re-victimization. And one of the ways that we found to help prevent re-victimization is to make sure that the folks that are surrounding these individuals have the type of knowledge and supports that they need. And also they are also listened and heard, as well as they've gone on very emotional journeys, oftentimes with the victims themselves. We want to lift up that the victims of financial fraud really have an identity crisis after they realize their victimization. They're not only receiving oftentimes judgment and the stigma from people outside of themselves, but they're really beating themselves up on the inside. They're questioning their dignity and their value. They want to oftentimes get to, again, that question of why me? Why did this happen? How could I allow this to take place? How could I allow this to impact myself and the people around me that I love? And it's so important for those of us who are supporting those individuals to continue to affirm their dignity and value, continue to highlight the parts of themselves that are still whole and still meaningful to them, whether that's their values or their abilities, their mindset, their capabilities. Understanding how to help individuals continue to recognize those folks within themselves is definitely a part of the healing journey. And again, we have to remember that in a lot of these scams and frauds that have a relationship aspect to it, there were needs that were getting met, and it usually comes in the terms of someone building up someone's self-esteem, someone's sense of self-efficacy. And so as the fraud starts to unravel, so can the stabilizing factors of those two ways of seeing yourself as well. So we want to just hone in and really make sure that we continue to rebuild agency. Next slide, please. And how do we do that in a very practical way? What we found over and over again is the first thing people need is just to be listened to, and not be judged, to be believed and respected, to help individuals feel confident and more comfortable sharing the stories and destigmatizing and taking some of that shame and isolation that could lead to re-victimization. Many of you on the call are in roles where you have the opportunity to be that safe person, to provide a place and an environment and a relationship in which victims can feel secure. Even if you can't solve the crime, even if you can't even impact the financial losses, you have such a role to play in helping individuals find their safety zone again. Affirming people's experiences, learning again about language and all of the reasons why people get involved, either consciously or even sometimes just passively into fraud situations is so important. And as people try to regain their sense of self and their sense of autonomy over their lives, encouraging those healthy boundaries, helping them see in spaces that might continue to be digging at their self-worth or their sense of, again, autonomy. How do you help them lean into more relationships that feel supportive while also learning that they can say no to relationships that are not? And then knowing the resources that you can offer folks that you come across who have been victimized and their loved ones. We have wonderful resources that we're sharing with you today, not just from Given Hour and NCVC and FINRA Foundation, but there's a lot of partners in this space. And we hope that you can continue to have those tools available, because making people feel less isolated in this journey is imperative to their healing. Next, please. Thank you. So I alluded to, again, this idea of building self-trust again. When you feel like you are a good judge of character, when you feel like you're a good business person, when your life, you've been told that you are competent and capable, and you have this type of victimization happens to you, it can really create a sense of disbelief in your own capabilities and your own power to trust yourself and make decisions that not only avoid harm, but add value to the lives of the people around you. And so we have to remember that that is going on within the victims, the the victims that we serve, and really reminding folks that they can make these small, consistent commitments to themselves, recognizing that even affirmations around being reliable, that they can count on themselves, helping them just take it day by day, step by step. You're showing up, you're doing the hard work, talking about it was really difficult today. You're making a good decision. I'm seeing you make proactive steps to get your life back to the place that you want it to be is really incredibly important in helping, again, help people understand their own sense of self-efficacy. Thank you. We all at Given Hour, we also work with loved ones of people who have been victimized by financial fraud. And we know that it's important to take that extra step in that circle because the folks who have surrounded a victim may love them, care for them deeply, and still contribute to ways of engaging that could lead to re-victimization. There's a lot of loss that is associated with these loved ones as well. Again, if a person loses a significant amount of money, and maybe that's again for college or for a wedding or to pass down to a grandchild, family dynamics can be disrupted where a parent who has been a financial rock for the family now becomes someone that others have to support. It changes roles, it changes responsibilities, and sometimes loved ones' responses, particularly I would say to the older population of individuals who get victimized, is to sometimes take their autonomy and control from them. It can erode trust, especially within the context of relationship scams. We've worked with folks in our peer support group, and I've talked with victims who, you know, had an emotional engagement with someone who was a fraud criminal. And then not only did they lose their husband and their home, but her children will no longer let her see her grandchildren because they feel like she's done such a betrayal to her husband of 40 years. And so we just really need to name that helping loved ones understand the experience, just as you are learning what this experience feels like and how anyone can be victimized, is incredibly important to help and reduce re-victimization as well. Go for it. So how do we do that? First of all, just recognizing that, family members, again, are going to show up with all their own feelings. They may feel unsupported, they can feel helpless. They want to solve problems, oftentimes, just like all of us do, or find ways to minimize the impact of what this crime has caused to their family. And as we all know, there aren't always a lot of opportunities to undo the harm that's been done, either financially or emotionally. And so as helpers to people who have been victimized and their loved ones, having conversations where you can acknowledge their emotional response to the situation, but also making sure that the responses aren't additionally harmful to the person who's been victimized. A lot of times they want to tighten up control of decisions, tighten up control over finances, which makes a lot of logical sense when you feel like someone has made decisions that have negatively impacted themselves and others. But it is important that there is a plan for autonomy to be brought back. And recognizing that, again, in all types of situations for the victim, the family can be a resource, but they can also be a stressor. And so helping that victim coach what they need and support from their families and how to talk about how they've been victimized can help tremendously in preventing a secondary fraud experience. So families, oftentimes when we are in peer support or when people reach out to us for clinical support, sometimes, we get loved ones, sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers who say, can you just help my loved one understand that they are being a victim of fraud, and not being able, even when victims come to the realization that something is not quite right here, the families are often ready for them to make an abrupt change, but reminding ourselves that they're getting some fundamental needs met through this engagement and this interaction. And so families can just feel very, very angry and very desperate to get their loved ones away from what they see as a tremendously harmful situation. Not feeling like there's any ways to protect your loved ones from that re-victimization. The legal structures that are set up can feel completely overwhelming and unhelpful, and that leads a lot of times to families that get really burnt out. This is a long journey for most individuals to get to understanding the victimization that's being happened, reporting, going through systems. This can take a long time for people to come out on the other side and feel like they are actually a survivor at this point. And so we just need to recognize that this is a long haul and we need to stay present. Okay, go ahead. Given our loves peer support so much, and shout out to our peer supporter, Victoria, who I see is on this call. We believe that individuals with lived experience do a remarkable job at helping other individuals bounce back and become resilient from the lived experiences that have been traumatizing to them. We have several different forms of peer support that we set up at Given Hour. One is for victims, one is for loved ones, and we've had some intersecting sessions as well with both to help them also get information from experts and specialists. We believe that not only does it help reduce the shame, but victims can exchange resources and hope within their own community as well. You're going to see some links at the end of this presentation that'll help connect you directly to our peer support as a resource for the folks that you're caring for. And then I want to just put a shout out to all of you out there who are working. I was actually in a conversation last week with someone who runs one of the large responses to fraud organizations. And we were talking about collaboration and partnership. And she came back and she's like, I'm exhausted, Julie. The amount of stories that I hear, the losses, the frustration, I'm really, really tired. And so it's so important to us that you as helpers are also taking care of yourself. So we like to always lift up these self-care practices that happen in all different types of domains. I'm encouraging you to think about the ways that you are caring for yourself, and also want to offer the opportunity. I think we can go to the next slide, Rob. The opportunity for you and your departments, your organizations, your institutions to take advantage of the resources that we have. We have a complete series on how to help folks understand financial fraud and the emotional journey that's open source and free. We invite you to check that out. And if you or any group of individuals want to reach out for some individualized or group support around how to maintain healthy boundaries while still showing up compassionately, we're here to support you in that way as well. All right, back to Rob.
Awesome. So these are a few of the different resources that we have available for you all. Those that have seen past webinars, you likely know these resources, but a few of them out here for you. You're welcome to go to our website, finrafoundation.org/fraudfighter. That's going to house all of our fraud-specific content for individuals like you all. And want to highlight our Taking Action Guide. That's one, we have it available in a hard copy, and it provides a guide for victim support. And this is one that NCVC and FINRA Foundation were actively working to update. So stay tuned. We should hopefully have an updated version of this coming to you all sometime, hopefully early next year. Other items we have like our Fighting Fraud 101 brochure. It provides different places you can go to report types of fraud and scams you're seeing, as well as some of those red flag tactics that are out there. We have our securities helpline. That's a great resource. If you come across somebody that appears to be having concern that's related to securities, the securities industry, you're welcome to call with that individual, direct them to call this number. They'll speak to our live support staff that are able to take that information and provide resources, direct them to different places to go, or even take information and start a review of allegations. So that's a great resource for you all to keep in mind. Kim.
Thanks. I'll leave you with one last resource. The National Center for Victims of Crime does operate a 24/7 helpline for victims of all types of crime through our Victim Connect Resource Center. Victims can call, text, or chat to get connected with a victim assistance specialist. And so that's a great resource to know about. They are very well versed in financial crimes and can get folks connected with additional resources. So I'll add a link to that in the chat, and I think we can go to our very last slide. We are just at time. We want to thank you all so much for the work that you do and for joining us today. Our contact information is here on the slide if you would like to reach out with any questions, or if you're looking for additional support. I know all of us would be happy to help. So thank you so much. As a quick reminder, the webinar today was recorded. Everyone that registered will receive a follow-up email within the next couple of weeks with the recording, as well as all of the links and resources that we shared today. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and take care.